It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker from the afternoon, Gaby Hornsby. Gaby is content editor at the BBC for 3 strategic priority areas: sustainability, mental health, and disability. She works across the BBC to maximise its impact with audiences on these topics and use the BBC's Unrivaled reach, so it has a fascinating job. Gaby managed the BBC's engagement with COP26 and the climate content pledge that was signed there. Prior to working in commissioning, she was an award-winning filmmaker across multiple genres. 2 of the many programs she worked on during that time were the 3-part documentaries, The Secret Life of the Motorway and The Secret Life of the Airport, celebrating the birth of these infrastructure phenomena. And in her own words, she is now paying penance by leading on sustainability across the BBC. We've asked Gaby to talk a bit about the impact that the BBC has had over the last 10 years and show some interesting examples and case studies. From the Blue Planet documentaries that led to society's awakening on the negative impacts of plastic, to storylines around coercive control on The Archers, a radio drama that's been running since the 1950s. She'll also touch on how the BBC approaches measuring and communicating its impact to its audience and society more broadly. Over to you, Gaby.
Thank you. And I would just add, as well as making programmes on motorways, airports, the national grid, I also made a programme about climate change. So it wasn't all high carbon behaviour. But thank you very much for having me. Great to be here for the 10-year anniversary of Mirrors or Movers and reflect on 10 years of impact across the BBC. So what does impact mean for a public service broadcaster with a profound commitment to impartiality and not to campaign, however worthy the cause? We can't measure our success on the basis of signatures to a petition, on policy objectives achieved. Our remit is very fundamentally to inform, educate, and entertain. But when we hit the sweet spot, then these 3 principles are incredibly powerful, able to inspire audiences when they make choices for themselves, for society, and for the planet. And when we do this at scale, we can open up a space for national conversation about who we are and what we want. So I've got 3 examples from 3 different genres: drama, factual, and entertainment. And I hope by looking at these 3 case studies to draw some conclusions and open up a discussion with you about how media can have a positive impact and be a public good. So the first case study I want to look at is The Archers. So in 2013, Helen met Rob. It was the start of a 3-year story playing out in people's homes, from first love to coercive control to eventual culmination in Helen's acquittal for Rob's attempted murder in September 2016. As their relationship developed, I vividly remember being in a car, another high carbon behaviour, I do occasionally, sitting in a car, listening and experiencing a prickling sense of discomfort and unease, a questioning about what was Rob doing, what was going on, and over a period that concern escalated. And I wasn't alone. Listeners vividly and viscerally experienced Rob's controlling behaviour and gaslighting, Helen's unravelling and bewilderment in the face of it. And through that experience grew within the population of listeners an understanding of the meaning of coercive control, and for some women, the shock of recognition that they were experiencing it in their own relationships. But the impact of that storyline in The Archers played out over those 3 years was phenomenal. Calls to the National Domestic Violence Helpline went up by 17%, dubbed by Women's Aid at the time the Archers Effect. £200,000 was donated to a women's charity in Helen's name, enough to fund almost 4,000 nights in a refuge. In the run-up to the trial, Free Helen, the trial this is in The Archers, Free Helen became a Twitter sensation, and the press coverage was extensive. Michael Gove, then Justice Secretary, described it as required listening in our house and said, "Helen's story has brought welcome attention to the real problems many women face from coercive and controlling men. Now Helen's plight has shone a light on the position of women in our prisons and reinforces the case for reform." Against the backdrop of the story, in December 2015, a law was passed that criminalised coercive control, and Helen was acquitted in the same week that one of the first people in the UK was convicted of the offence. And just to prove that this sort of social impact storyline doesn't harm your audience figures, at the story peak, downloads from BBC Sounds doubled. So I think, what can we learn from this impactful story of the Archers? I think what it shows is the incredible power of our soaps or continuing dramas to take known and loved characters and show almost in real time a storyline develop, immersing the audience in the character's experience, not being told it, but feeling it, learning it, as they do. And we can think of other powerful work our soaps have done around mental health and LGBTQ representation, for example. But it's not just dramas that can deliver huge impact. Blue Planet 2 transmitted in the UK in 2018 before broadcasting internationally. Famously, it broke the internet in China, or at least slowed it down so much that the speed was crawling as so many people tried to download the series. But apart from the gorgeous visuals and the cute animals traditionally associated with natural history programming, it contained some sterner stuff. At that time, that degree of explicit environmental content in natural history programming was new, and indeed, the inclusion of it provoked quite a lot of discussion in the edit and how appropriate it was in Sunday night viewing. But the result was a series watched by 750 million people worldwide, showing again that engaging with topics like this is good for ratings and not an audience turn-off. The series sparked a global campaign against ocean plastic pollution, and Michael Gove, yes, again, obviously a keen BBC watcher, tweeted about it. It galvanised behavioural and policy changes, from soaring purchases of reusable water bottles to the UK government's ban on single-use plastic straws, cotton buds and drink stirrers. From personal plastic challenges to the G20 agreeing an international framework to address marine plastic litter. In recognition, BBC Studios' Natural History Unit and Sir David Attenborough won the Chatham House Prize for the series for impact and contribution to international relations. Now here in this case, it's not a drama, clearly it's a factual programming, and I think the power of the trusted voice was key, and the fact that the BBC is known for impartiality and that Sir David Attenborough brought the weight of his expertise wasn't a hindrance, but was actually a strength. Not being a campaigning piece, it let the viewer draw its own conclusions so powerfully from the story that was told. But what it did do was it opened up a space for NGOs and other organisations who had long been talking about this issue to bring their policy solutions to the table and take part in a conversation that the BBC helped ignite. And our natural history series have gone on to engage with environmental topics more explicitly ever since. And our audience research shows that it continues to be impactful with audiences. The Green Planet on earlier this year reached almost 13 million people in the UK. And we've got audience research showing that, for example, 71% said that watching the series encouraged them to be more environmentally friendly in their actions. But after domestic violence, plastic pollution, I thought we needed something a little bit more fun. So on to Strictly. And the last of my 3 examples is from entertainment. It's deaf actress Rose Ayling-Ellis's joyous and glitter globe winning appearance on Strictly Come Dancing last year. Now, in 2014, research by Scope revealed that a staggering 2/3 of the British public admitted that they felt uncomfortable talking to disabled people. Now, considering that the incidence of disability in the UK population is around 20%, that really leaves very few people who are not disabled and are happy speaking to a disabled person. So, into this space appeared Rose. Her joy, the power of her communication, and her eloquence and humanity did a huge job in breaking down stigma. And watching the series, you could not help but be captivated by her. Strictly was the #1 entertainment show across all TV in the UK in 2021, with that moving dance tribute to the deaf community voted TV Moment of the Year by the British public and winning a BAFTA. At the time that the series transmitted, during transmission, actually towards the beginning of the series, then Rose shared on Twitter that there had already been a almost 500% increase in online searches for sign language, learning sign language. The Institute of British Sign Language and other BSL training providers also reported surges in interest and enrolments and courses. And in the House of Commons debate about the Private Members Bill recognising British Sign Language as an official language in January this year, Strictly Come Dancing and the power of Rose's appearance was quoted no less than 8 times. Not by Michael Gove on this occasion, not the only MP to watch the BBC. So in April this year, and after Rose's support for the bill, the Act received royal assent and passed into law. So what do we take from this third example? In TV, we often talk about a contributor's journey, and here that was key. We saw Rose develop over the series, her friendship grow with dance partner Giovanni, and her blossoming confidence, so that we could get to know her as a fully rounded individual, one that we could empathise with and not sympathise with, one who was part of the Strictly family, as is often referred to on the show, and not as an other. And for those in the deaf community, they could see themselves on screen represented. And that personal journey has been a key part of many of our documentaries at the BBC, addressing mental health, for example, also having a power and impact, whether that be Katie Price and her experience with her disabled son Harvey, or David Harewood, for example, and his experience of psychosis. But looking in the round at these 3 examples, what insights can we take from them collectively? I think one thing I'd like to emphasise again is they were all big audience winners. So that episode, that series of Strictly, was the most inclusive Strictly that there had been. Not only was there Rose, there was also the first male and male dance couple. That inclusion did not hurt Strictly's ratings, it boosted them. So the first thing to point out is that doing work in this area does not necessarily equate to your content being worthy, boring, and that audiences don't want to engage. But beyond that, then one of our fundamental parts of our charter says that we should provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them, so that all audiences can engage fully with major issues and participate in the democratic process at all levels as active and informed citizens. But we know from behavioural science that information alone doesn't change behaviours. Even changing attitudes has limited effect. I think the magic happens when we marry facts and information with emotion. Show, don't tell. Engage, don't lecture. We are social creatures. The immersive drama, the trusted presenter, the contributor on a journey, all show people we can relate to, encounter situations, and learn with them as they do. Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this. You know, the scientists tell us that climate change is a major threat, and TV certainly hasn't solved it yet. But I think if we can open up a space for national conversation that's informed and engaged, in that space, then change can happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those examples with us. So we've now got around 20 minutes for a Q&A. And maybe I can start us off on the point that you made that all these were big episode winners. You know, it doesn't harm the ratings, it improves them. And yet what I think interests me about, for example, Blue Planet, is that plastic pollution was not its topic. You know, it wasn't about that. It was a small part within that episode and within that series that mentioned plastic. What do you think that tells us about how we weave sustainability into content?
I mean, it's certainly true that Blue Planet 2 wasn't entirely about environmental issues, although it did cover many, plastic, coral bleaching, and others. But Blue Planet 2, as I mentioned, got a huge audience. David Attenborough's Climate Change: The Facts got a significant audience, but much smaller. You know, and I think that we need to be honest with ourselves that as soon as you label something very explicitly as this is environmental content or this is diverse content, then you immediately narrow your audience because you're saying it's something for people interested, you know, with a specific interest in that topic. And frankly, even if you are interested in climate change, it can be really depressing. And on a Saturday night, you probably don't want to watch a program about it. So I think that there is absolutely a role, and indeed, in some ways, the bigger impact we can have is how we embed these topics within our mainstream and most popular programs. And the Climate Content Pledge that you mentioned earlier, that the BBC signed along with the UK's other major broadcasters, we're one of 12 who signed up to it, including ITV, Channel 4, Sky, Paramount, Channel 5 and Paramount, is exactly about that. It's how do we bring these topics into the whole spectrum of our programming and don't narrow our audience at the outset.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And related to that, I guess another question in my mind is how do we reach the not yet converted? You know, you and I might see a New Nature documentary and we immediately watch it, but you know, not every, you know, that nature documentaries, you know, target a specific audience. How do we reach the not yet converted?
I think that, you know, it's worth saying that in the UK, certainly what the data suggests is very different from what the data suggests in America. We are far less polarized around environmental issues, for example. The latest BES, Department of Energy, Industry and Industrial Strategy, they have a public attitude survey, a tracker. The one in spring this year showed that 84% of the UK population are worried about climate change. So I think that concern about the environment is not universal, but it is very high. And again, multiple surveys show that that cross-cuts politics, it cross-cuts demographics, it cross-cuts socioeconomic class. But I think the way that we frame our messaging is really important here. You know, if you only talk about sustainability from the perspective of white middle-class people with plenty of money, then you are going to alienate those sections of your audience who don't fall into that demographic, who do care about the environment and do care about climate change, but don't feel their views, their perspective is represented. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very much a responsibility and a challenge to us in the media to think about our audience, where our audience is at, what media they're consuming, and how we speak to them about a subject that they care about in a way that resonates with them. And shows people like them engaging in activities that are meaningful and authentic to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that means really increasing, it sort of goes back to diversity, increasing the diversity of voices that we include in this space.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's our next session, so stay tuned for that. So if you have a question in the room, please simply raise your hand. I've got more to go, but I see a question there. A microphone will come to you. Please make sure that you speak into it clearly so that our online audience can hear you as well.
Yeah, I'm going to try. Hope it's okay.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
From Axido. First, thanks a lot. It was very inspiring as a presentation. I have a quick question related to what you mentioned regarding letting the audience decide for themselves, not being a marketer, right? But really opening the conversation. We often hear that it's you feel a bit, even if you want to act, you feel a bit helpless in sort of how do I contribute, right? Does it mean that you also think that prior of announcing a big new drama or entertainment content, do you work with organization, NGOs and so on to give them this is happening and you will be able to use that for you to engage with the audience, right? Because I understand that's not your role, but are you having a sort of a preparation work with with NGOs on specific matters that are being addressed so that they can create their roadmap and plan for this as well?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it slightly depends on a case-by-case basis. And for the BBC, I think what we do in this space is different from what ITV, for example, might choose who has a little bit more room for manoeuvre. At the BBC, if we have a really big mental health documentary and we think that there's going to be a surge in calls to helplines, then at that point, I might well reach out to the mental health sector and say, heads up, this is coming. Because we have an action, we point to our action line. Our action line includes their call numbers and their website addresses. So, it's sometimes useful for them to know that they might get a surge in interest. What is difficult is if we went to the environmental campaigning sector and said, we're doing a program, it's going to talk about plastics, get your policy initiatives ready and ready to go and lobby the government immediately after broadcast. Because then that's when we start drifting into the campaigning territory. So there's a line to tread whereby we can help and enable audiences but not fall into that category of campaigning. But we do, we have a dialogue with various sectors. But as I said, it's always walking that particular line. I think ITV does some amazing work in mental health where they have much more explicit link-ups with mental health charities who they can sort of promote their work much more explicitly than we're at liberty to do at the BBC.
Thanks, Gaby. Maybe one more question from me. You mentioned quite a few kind of stats around the impact that the programs that have had. Green Planet, 71% of people said that they would make a change in their behavior to become greener. And of course, there's lots of examples of specific pieces of content where, a media company's been able to understand the impact that that's had. But do we need to move towards being able to measure that across a portfolio of content to really see what content works or doesn't work? And how would we do that?
I think this is the million-dollar question at the moment amongst broadcasters, but also more widely in the sort of media and entertainment sector. So there's a pan-broadcaster group off the back of the Climate Content Pledge. We're at the moment talking about exactly this question: how do we measure our impact? Is it possible to have an ongoing system to talk about and evaluate what we do? Okra, another organisation, have a pan-media group, which I also sit on, where we're also looking at the same question, okay, how do we measure what we do? I don't think any of us have come up with the answer yet. So I would say, very much work in progress and watch this space. I think one of the constraints is expense, and how much it costs to run longitudinal panels, for example. But it's definitely an area that we know is on the to-do list, and that we need to find some solution, even if it's an imperfect one. I'm not sure, to be honest, having been talking about this for months, I'm not sure that the perfect solution is out there, but I think we need to try and iterate from where we are at the moment.
Yeah, and looking towards the future, I think the concept of double materiality and understanding, a company's impact on society is gaining traction. And we know, of course, the European taxonomy and legislation around CSRD forcing companies to report on their impact on sustainability and their revenue share from sustainability, financial markets looking at that. And this idea that, as media companies, we will need to be able to articulate our impact on society. Do you think that's really going to drive a step change in efforts on this impact measurement question?
I think it's really interesting. I think considering the journey that we've been on in the last 10 years when Mirrors and Movers started, and there was a question about whether it was even appropriate to talk about the impact of media, to a point that looking, futurescaping and looking at the regulatory future, there's certainly the potential in the UK to have to articulate our impact. I think that's sort of quite a significant turnaround in the last 10 years. I think it definitely makes it more pressing that we find a way to talk about our impact and what we do. And certainly, as we all, as public service broadcasters, I say we all, we're not all public service broadcasters here, but some of us are. But as public service broadcasters, I think that the need not only to articulate our positive role in society from a potential regulatory point of view, I think the need to justify our existence in an incredibly competitive media market, and in the face of questionings about our role, our funding models, then I think being able to articulate the public good that we can provide is increasingly important, whether that's what the BBC did around the pandemic, or what we do in the space of mental health, how we behave in the sustainability space. I think it's sort of vital both for our survival with audiences, with governments, with stakeholders, and potentially with regulation coming down the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got a question from someone online, Richard. How do you challenge the perception or reality in some cases that being environmentally conscious is too expensive, or at least more expensive than other options? As an example, in the cost of living crisis, it's important we recognize that environmental or fair trade or socially conscious products or services typically cost more. Is there a danger that being environmentally or socially conscious only becomes achievable in the more affluent parts of society?
I think that it's a really good point, and I think it's very hard if you want to speak to a broad audience to encourage people to take the train, not to fly, if the train is consistently more expensive than the flight. You know, those are systemic changes, and it is unreasonable to encourage audiences to always make choices that are more expensive and more inconvenient for them. Mm-hmm. And that's where we need to sort of open up a conversation around systemic change and not just load individuals with the burden of that. I think the cost of living crisis actually opens up an opportunity because there are behaviours which are cost-saving and not cost-increasing. You know, energy costs money. Reduce your energy use, you reduce your expenses, and you know, as a co-benefit, you also help the environment. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to look for ways of finding and talking about those cost savings and about cheap ways of eating less meat that, you know, involve lentil bolognese as opposed to beef bolognese, that don't necessarily involve high expense, highly processed meat alternatives. There are ways of reducing your meat intake, which doesn't mean buying expensive meat alternatives, but using store cupboard staples, you know, where you can get a tin of pulses for under £1. Mm-hmm. You know, there are other ways of doing it, and you know, if you look at very simple draft proofing in your homes, I think we need to definitely lean into that space where we can show consumers how they can save money, and that, you know, helping the planet is a positive sort of afterthought. It doesn't need to be the primary motivator. Yeah,
and I guess part of that as well is making those consumption choices aspirational, which is what our panel in the afternoon will talk about. Any more questions from the room? Do raise your hand high if I may not see you. We've got one in the back there. Jeremy?
Hi. So thanks for sharing those examples, and you can feel the emotion when seeing all of these, hear and see these images. For me, it talks to the point that we're creative industries, and those programs work because there's creative talents behind it. And it's a creative industry that is led by commissioners, producers, writers, a whole industry of creative people. So how do we bring all of these people along the journey together so that we have those creative juices working in the right direction?
So Jeremy and I, sort of full disclosure here, Jeremy and I have worked together and know each other quite well, and this is a conversation that is ongoing as an industry. I think it's a real skills challenge for the media sector about how do we upskill everyone so that they feel confident and equipped to talk about these issues and creatively respond to them. And I think that's a journey that we're on, and I think it's a really key question about how do we accelerate that knowledge. And I think, events like these, and the BBC ran Climate Creatives last week. I have to say, it's online. Google Climate Creatives 2022. There's a load of sessions on last Wednesday on exactly this, looking to upskill the industry. And I think it's sort of beholden on broadcasters to open up conversations with our suppliers to try and find a way where we can all learn together.
Great, thank you. Any last questions in the room? Maybe I have a one to end on, and we kind of touched on it already. But I think a lot of the conversations that we have around this are around talking to citizens or to consumers and getting individual change, whether that's how you vote, whether that's what you consume, how you travel. But some of these problems are really systematic problems and require action from governments. What do you think the role of media is in holding governments to account and helping citizens hold governments to account?
I think, as I said in the speech, then, as an independent media, then we're not there to campaign. and to campaign for specific policy change. But we are absolutely there to hold government to account. That is one of our roles as a news broadcaster. So I think holding government to account and getting better to hold them to account, getting better at holding them to account on their commitments and whether they're delivering on those commitments is certainly part of, the remit of anyone engaged in news reporting at the moment. So I think that's something that we have a duty to do. It's part of our charter, but also there is an audience appetite for it. It's really interesting at the BBC, we have a sustainability tracker where, we have lots of trackers where we do polling to find out what audiences think, what they want to know about, what programs they enjoy, like any company creating media. But one of the things we ask is, in terms of environmental issues, we have a whole list of things, what do you want to know about most? And consistently, number one, is things I can personally do to make a difference. That's consistently we've been running this particular tracker for almost 2 years, and that's consistently number one. But what has been moving up the rankings is what government and business are doing. Because I think there's absolutely a realization amongst the population that, it's all very well for me to have a reusable water bottle, but that really isn't going to shift the dial fundamentally. There are bigger things at work here. So I think in terms of responding to our audiences, it's also really important that we don't make them feel bad and keep on saying, it's up to you, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, when it's obvious that it's not possible for us to do this. Even collectively, we need that systemic engagement as well.
Yeah.
So we need to sort of have both conversations running in parallel.
Great. Well, there's a lot of work happening with the Climate Content Pledge, around developing impact measurement frameworks. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years?
I don't know. I think it's, we're meant to be halving our emissions by 2030. The BBC, a lot of other broadcasters, and I suspect lots of other people and companies in this room have net zero commitments with, science-based targets, with that commitment to halve emissions in the next, by 2030. 8 years isn't long to do it. I think that it's an uphill journey the next 8 years, but, you have to believe it's possible. If any of you can listen to a podcast called Outrage and Optimism, I'd really recommend it. It's not by the BBC on this occasion. It's Christiana Figueres, who helped negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement, and she says, you have to be optimistic because there isn't another option. We have to believe we can do it because there isn't another option.
Absolutely, and 3 degrees of warming is better than 4, which is better than 5, so there will always be something to fight for.
Yes, every ton of carbon.
Great, thank you, Gaby.
Thank you.